Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked about contingency planning last time. We're talking about identification and authentication today. But first, we're talking about beers. Tom, what is this? It looks like a paint can.
Yeah, and I think that's an apt description of it. It's called Color Cloud Pink. And I'm going to just read you the description on this beer, Kayne, because, on the surface, I think you're going to like it. It's a Berliner Weisse, which is wheat,
Sounds
with
German.
pink guava, dragon fruit, and passion fruit.
Oh, dear.
So it should be somewhat fruity. Now, I will warn you that a Berliner Weisse is a sour, so
No.
You've got that to look forward to.
Okay, thanks.
I'm saying, I mean, there's not much to see on this can. I mean, it's
No, I
it's
do
just
like
pretty basic.
I do like the picture. It's basic iconography. That's kind of cool. I'm sure we'll have a professional shot. It does have a QR code on the back, so that's neat.
This is from Equilibrium Brewing, which is, I think, a New York brewery, if I'm not mistaken.
All right.
So
Well, let's have a go and see what it's about.
I'm cracking it. Oh my! It already looks interesting. It looks like
you haven't had
something
this
that
before. I'm guessing.
I've never had this.
Some of these beers, What the?
Yeah, this looks like Ecto Cooler or something.
Sorry,
I mean,
this
like
is
something
like
you'd...
straight up pink.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's got a smell.
I don't think the camera picks up just how pinkish red this is.
Is this a beer, Tom? I mean, this looks like those coolers that you can get in the summer, right?
It's a malted beverage, so it's a malted alcoholic beverage. So yes, it's a beer. It's brewed, but this passes well beyond what I typically would drink.
Tom,
let's just look at it.
That, according to you, it says that Ole is a beer now.
Ole.
Oh, you don't have Old English where you are. Okay, cool. We'll move on past that West Coast reference.
Okay.
So I think let's try to appreciate the weird color of this. It
has a pretty thin
color.
head. It disappeared very quickly.
Well,
from a smell perspective, it is very fragrant.
Yeah, smells bitter.
I mean, it's got a bitter smell. It's also got, you can definitely,
something fruity in there.
If you could smell sour, I would say this smells sour. Yeah, you smell fruit. I smell dragon
sour
fruit, I think, more than anything.
How often do you eat dragon fruit? Because I'm trying to think of the last time I had a dragon fruit.
My daughter picks up odd fruit everywhere we go and wants us to try it. So I've actually had it more than star fruit, dragon fruit, passion fruit. I've had all of it.
Cool. All right.
I'm going to taste it. Very sour.
Oh.
Very fruity.
Oh.
I don't have nearly the reaction to something I don't like that you
That
do.
bit me.
That's my favorite reaction so far, Kayne.
So true fact, I don't like those those Sour Patch Kids that you could get like when you're in grade school. Like, I do not like sour things, and that is
my second drink was better than my first.
Okay, I feel like Lucy with the football here.
So you can't help but get the sour when you first drink it, but
yeah,
if you let that pass, you do taste the fruit, which is more interesting than I would have given it credit for initially.
Oh no! Oh.
I don't taste the guava in that at all, but I do taste passion fruit, and I do taste.
Okay, I'm getting the passion fruit now.
Fruit, so.
Yeah, it's got kind of a lingering aftertaste. It's not very bubbly either. It's like
yeah, I would agree with that. There's just not a lot.
There's a winery in where the heck is that place? It's south of me. There's a winery that's south of me, and they do a lot of fruit wines. And for a while there, like, friends kept bringing them, and they all kind of tasted like this. They had like a cranberry wine. It was meant to be served cold, and kind of similar, but not as. It didn't have the skunky taste to it as well. Wonder what my review number is going to be on this one. It's going to be an odd one, Tom.
This has grown on me just a little bit. I'm not going to lie. It's not my favorite, but My initial reaction was pretty low. This is growing on me a little.
All right. Well, you're going to work on that. I've had mine. Yeah. Okay.
You had your fill.
Ouch. Some poor friend of mine is going to come around and find a can of this lurking in my garage and go, "Why did you have that?" And I'll have to explain it's for work.
That's right. Of course.
All right, let's move on. Let's move on to our topic of the day. And Tom, what is the identification and authentication control family in FedRAMP Moderate? What's it all about?
Yeah, I would say, if we wanted to cut through the Latin that is NIST language, we would just call this the password and authentication control set, right? Because there's going to be lots of common controls that everybody implements underneath identification and authentication. It's going to give you your prescriptive requirements around passwords, for instance, which everybody already knows. Everybody almost uniformly has implemented, but it's also going to give you some controls around things like external devices for authentication or secondary means of authentication, and what are those appropriate? How are those appropriately controlled? What is appropriate to use in terms of cryptographic controls around it? So there's lots of things interesting wrapped around it. The one thing, Kayne, that I will say that I think might surprise folks is when you're going through the kind of routine password controls, you'll find out that they do not require password changes on any given schedule. And that's because NIST, quite a few years ago now, actually adopted the idea that we don't need to change passwords, that it's actually more insecure as long as you build an initially secure password.
Yep.
Use two-factor authentication. Yep. It is more insecure to rotate passwords than it is to be static. So I still see, I look in the wild at other people's controls if they're publicly available.
And it tends to be awful. I mean, I always tell people, just go read NIST 863B. I'm sure we'll put a link to that in the show notes, but go read NIST 863B. And also, one other thing that I like about in FedRAMP Moderate is that they include user identity and multi-factor authentication for users, but they also include the category of device identity. And for those who are working towards a zero trust approach towards security, which despite the marketing hype is actually a legitimate strategy, you'll find device identity and user identity are treated separately, and that is very intentional. So I like that FedRAMP Moderate had that inclusion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the idea that you do not authenticate devices, you really open yourself up to a whole host of new vulnerabilities, right? I mean, essentially, if you're not authenticating the device, you do not know if the device that is connecting meets all of the other controls that you've already deemed as necessary, right? So making sure that the inventory of devices that you have are getting patched and have the appropriate antivirus on it and whatever other controls you put on it before you actually approve its authentication capability, that's critical. And it's when you're a SaaS company, that's even more critical.
Definitely,
right? Because you're now connecting remotely, potentially to a back end through VPN or whatever, but still, you want to have those controls in place.
So I want to just double down on this one because I think a lot of people might look at this and think passwords, and they might miss device identity, or they might miss some of the nuance. And FedRAMP is very, as you said, prescriptive. I've read the assessment criteria. They are very intentional in that. But Tom, can you explain why these particular controls, again, within identification and authentication, are critical to the overall framework, not just this one control family?
I can. And, what's interesting to me about this is folks will just kind of stop at the password level and they'll kind of forget that there's all of this meat behind it, right? But in general, this is the key to the front door, essentially, right? So if you don't control, we talk about defense in depth and we talk about controlling your perimeter, but if you don't control the person that can unlock that perimeter and have a good understanding of who that person is and are they authorized and do they have maybe a second form of authentication, which is prescriptive in FedRAMP as well, then essentially you're saying anybody who has just one simple key can get in.
It's not only that. It's not just they can get into your perimeter, Tom. It's they can do stuff inside of that perimeter through step-up authentication, right? Because in my house, I could have, for example, a locked safe right? And using that analogy, I'd say inside of your authorization boundary, you may have assets or enclaves that require additional privilege to get into, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, essentially, once you're in, you have legitimate use case inside of that space, and you are no longer underneath the purview of potentially a bunch of tools that are set there to monitor, because you're authenticated and you're in, right? So getting that piece of it correct is so critical. I mean, I think everybody understands that point, but I think they still miss the nuance, right? They miss the idea that authentication just isn't a person. It's also the device in which the person is coming in. And certainly that's based upon the role in which they play in the organization as well. We don't particularly get concerned about the user of our system, right? We don't authenticate their device, but the developer of our system, we absolutely want to authenticate their device. Anybody who works past the sort of the front door of our application, we absolutely need to authenticate device-wise.
Definitely. And in order to illustrate some of this nuance, I've picked a selective set of controls. And so I want to focus on some specific controls. IA2 subsection 2. Right, we're already getting weedy. IA2 subsection 2 deals with network access to non-privileged accounts. Could you help us understand the importance of that control and the risks associated with non-privileged accounts if they're not properly authenticated?
Sure. Again, we're talking about non-privileged accounts, which means they are not the heightened God type people inside of an application. They're generally just straight end user, correct? But again, when you get in, like if you think about an application like what we produce, right, Hyperproof, when you get in, you have access to data because that is what the application is all about, right? So an end user to our application has some access to data that you would say is, well, the federal government would say is CUI, or classified
or FCI,
uncontrolled information,
right? One of the two, maybe.
Yeah,
or something
CI,
else,
correct? Or they have the access to things like potentially some HR data, right? That not just everybody normally has access to. Well, when you have somebody who authenticates in that is just a regular user, you want to put additional authentication capabilities around that user, just because the ability to get to extra data, right? Again, when it's not just our application we're talking about, they have the ability to land and expand inside that space as well. And that's what you want to prevent, right? Land and expand, meaning that if they are somebody who has everyday user credentials, but they're a bad guy, they get in, they can start to exploit other vulnerabilities within the system that the perimeter prevents them from exploiting.
Oh, yeah, and it's worth doubling down on that point as well, in that any competent threat actor is going to immediately move out of their landing zone. The fact that they just happen to have that as their LZ, that's not their target. They're going to move onwards to glory, whatever that might be, often through the compromise of a non-privileged and then working towards a privileged account. And speaking of that, let's talk about some scenarios here. Can you give us a real-world scenario where an organization could fail to meet IA2 subsection 2 requirements and the potential repercussions of such a failure?
Well, this is a case where I think auditors will be very stringent. So I would say on identity and authentication in general, it's not just IA2, but auditors are going to look very closely at this control set. They're going to demand a high level of adherence to it. Not that they don't across the control set family, but areas of focus are a real thing with auditors, and this would be an area of focus in my mind. They want to make sure that, as we've used the analogy of the front door, right? They want to make sure that you guys have secured the front door, and so I would say this is a critical set, and if you're not complying to it, you're gonna get dinged. And I'm not sure the level in which audit will essentially shelve you for this, but if it's a POAM, you'll have 180 days to resolve it. But they may halt at that point and say, you guys have work to do. This is a simple set of controls.
All right, I want to move to another set of kind of a pet topic of mine, and it's because I was working with smart cards before the proverbial PIV-CAC cards. So I want us to move on to control IA2 subsection 12, where it talks about personal identification verification compliant credentials, or PIV. So what are PIV credentials, and how do they add an extra layer of security?
Yeah, a PIV credential is something you have. In the federal government, you would think of PIV as potentially a card with a chip in it. That can be a PIV. Has your picture on it and maybe some other details. But a PIV can also be something you have, like your eyeballs or your fingertips, right? It can be a biometric control. I don't know why they go out of their way to make the language difficult to understand, but it's that simple. So there's no magic behind it. It's an authenticator, a secondary authenticator that you have of some variety.
So PIV can be used in multi-factor authentication.
Correct.
Okay, fantastic for humans, I imagine.
That's right. And I think about some of the PIV solutions that you've had in this space in the past, and they've come and gone, right? I mean, largely, we're dealing with biometrics or potentially a random generator on a phone. But for anybody who carried around those little devices that random generated from RSA.
Oh, the old RSA fobs? Yeah. I was watching a television show the other day, actually, Rabbit Hole, and they had one of those in it. And I was like, wow, that's a callback to a long time ago.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, haven't seen one of those in the wild for a while. Of course, when RSA got hacked, that sort of was an end to seeing those in general.
Yeah, everybody. Well, I had one melt on a dashboard at a car I had parked out in the sun in Arizona, and I went, "Oh, this has got some physical vulnerabilities to it." You just don't see those anymore. But good to know that PIV can now be used for multi-factor authentication, and it doesn't have to be a classic PIV-CAC card because the readers on those were fidgety. Let's move on to IA3, which refers to device authentication and authentication. You talked a bit about this at the top of the show. Can you walk us through the importance of device identification in the context of network security and the potential threats if it's not adequately addressed?
Yeah, again, this is the device in which you authenticate from and whether or not you want to allow that on network, right? So essentially, again, if you think about it, that device can be either a controlled or uncontrolled device. And anytime you're dealing with a controlled, secure network where you've got FedRAMP involved, you want to make sure you know what that device is and you've already exerted controls over it. That's what really this is about. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like having the right antivirus on it and, having, encryption and in a hardened baseline configuration. It's those kinds of things. That's what you're going to want to make sure is certified before those devices get on. So essentially, as you move through your asset lifecycle and you put a new device in play, all that stuff gets configured. It gets an agent on it, and then that identification or that hardware identification gets input into the system. And it might be a combination of things. Generally, it's like a MAC address, right? That verifies that device. But I've seen other, if you have a full-on NAC or something like that in your environment that verifies a number of different attributes, that's possible as well.
Yeah, and I've also seen in companies' incident response plans that if devices are on network inside perimeter or inside boundary, depending on terminology and use of the organization, right? They're given a time to be kind of black holed, and if nobody can identify them, they just get evicted. And the reason for that was the risk of implants in those environments, which were network-attached devices that nobody could identify that could be being operated by an unknown operator, which sometimes is adversarial, sometimes is shadow IT, as you say.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in my career, we found devices that we thought were potentially something maliciously in intent. Mm-hmm. Usually it ends up being, the director of something was in town and left it plugged in a conference room and then left town, and it's that kind of a device. But certainly, in high espionage centric markets or businesses, this is a real threat. Mm-hmm. It's something that has to be considered critical to control.
Right, definitely. All right, I want to focus on another specific control. I want to focus on IA5, which it has some obtuse language, Tom. It discusses authenticator management. So can you please tell us what authenticators are? Because not everyone's going to be familiar with that term, and how the complexity and management of those authenticators can really impact a security posture for an organization?
Sure. Authenticators are a number of things, but they're largely whatever it is that you can authenticate with. So passwords, hardware devices, biometrics, whatever it is that you're authenticating with, that is an authenticator. So I believe that the FedRAMP, this section, the identification and authentication, kind of breaks it out, right? So up top is all the password requirements. So when they get down and they start talking about authenticator and IA5, they're more often than not, they're talking about hardware-based authenticators. So it's things like your random number generator, which is something we use, right? On our laptops or on our phones or whatever we want to use it. That's our secondary means. But the reality is the term authenticator, it seems like it's one of those words that NIST threw into their pile of language that nobody else uses in the industry.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to pick on it there, because it does feel a bit foreign, right? Because some people, I've also met folks who just think it means passwords, and they don't think, as you said, it could include a hardware-based authenticator or a time-based authenticator, like a rotating random code. Yeah. But those also have to be managed, and I imagine there's a bit of life cycle in there too, right, Tom? Not so much for passwords because of NIST 863B, but if we issue somebody a time-based token, and let's say it's like one of those RSA key fobs, just thinking of those, we have to have a way of deprovisioning those or retrieving them from people who are no longer requiring that access, right?
That's right. And not only that, but you have to have a way to dole them out as well. And that's all prescribed in this control set. So how do you get them and how do you deprecate them, or is both described in the control set. So you have to have some controls around that, as you should anyway. These are best practices, and just put in a prescriptive manner, right? So yeah, if you don't have that already, be prepared as you implement FedRAMP. You will have to have those in place.
Fantastic. And I think we've probably covered enough on things for FedRAMP Moderate. For identification and authentication, there are a few other ones in there that go to FedRAMP High, but we're not going to talk about those today. Instead, I want to talk about what I've been staring at on my table. Usually at the end of the show, oh dear.
I've actually
I still have some left in the can.
Into that. Yeah.
So hold up. Okay, I didn't all fit. Yeah. Okay. Well, there we are. I've had that much. Okay. Usually at the end of the show, I do have another sip, just to see how its taste has changed over time. So here goes. Nope, it's still a 1. It's I need to brush my tongue after this. That is genuinely terrible. This is a 1. I don't know if I've given a 1 before on the Tom. This I can barely talk. It is that bad. This is a 1 for me. My opinion. What about you?
Okay. Well, obviously you don't like sours, so that's an initial sort of mark against it. I don't love sours, although I can drink them, and there's been a couple that I really like. So I'm going to be a little more favorable to this. I will say when I initially drank it, it was something I could choose to not drink again. Afterwards, though, it opened up a little bit, and I got to see some of the character in it. So I would give this a 4, largely based upon the fact that I don't typically drink sours, so that takes some points off. But this opens up. You get to taste some of the character in it. And if you like sours, I suspect you will like this.
You know, Tom, I think we might have to check the tape. This might actually be our lowest rated beer. I can't think of anything you've given with less than a 5.
Yeah, that could be.
This one might be
I feel like there was one where we were both 3, but I could be wrong.
Could be, yeah. I mean, we have had a number of beers now. Well, anyhow, other people can check the tape too. Please do. With that, I think we've hit time for today. So if you've enjoyed the show, please do like and subscribe. Leave comments and questions below. And with that, we're out. So thanks for watching.